Ever get that feeling like there's some kind of secret playbook out there for success? Like if you could just crack the code, you'd unlock amazing results in all parts of your life. Well, today we're doing a deep dive into Principles,
Okay.
the book by Ray Dalio,
Interesting.
the mastermind behind Bridgewater Associates, which, by the way,
Yeah.
is the world's biggest hedge fund.
And what's interesting is that Dalio doesn't just talk about money.
Right.
He lays out a whole philosophy for making smarter choices that applies to, well, pretty much anything.
Right.
From how you handle your career to your personal relationships.
So for this deep dive, we've got excerpts from the book itself, plus a podcast episode that kind of breaks down some of the core ideas.
I see.
Now, Dalio's book is built around this idea of building a principled life.
Okay.
It might sound kind of abstract, but it's actually about creating a framework for making decisions that are in line with your values and ultimately lead to a more fulfilling life.
A key piece of that framework is something Dalio calls radical transparency.
Radical transparency.
He argues that creating an environment where truth is the top priority, even above ego, is essential for growth, both personally and professionally.
Okay, I'm already feeling a little out of my comfort zone here.
Really?
Most of us are taught to kind of smooth things over, not rock the boat, So how does this radical honesty actually work in practice?
Well, at Bridgewater, they have this system called baseball cards.
Baseball cards.
Where every employee has a card that lists their strengths and weaknesses as assessed by their colleagues.
Wow.
Imagine having your coworkers openly rate your ability to listen. Or your tendency to get defensive.
Wow, that does sound intense. I can see how that could create some awkward moments in the break room.
But the idea is that by putting it all out in the open, you create an environment where feedback is expected and valued.
Okay.
The podcast episode we have argues that this leads to better decisions, faster learning, and, surprisingly, even stronger relationships.
So maybe a little bit of discomfort up front can actually lead to more trust and connection in the long run. It's definitely making me think about how I give and receive feedback in my own life.
Absolutely. It's not just about being brutally honest all the time.
Right.
It's about creating a culture where people feel safe to share their perspectives, even if they're dissenting opinions.
Right.
And that leads to better outcomes for everyone involved.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this could be a game changer, and not just in the workplace.
Exactly.
But radical transparency is just one part of Dalio's philosophy.
Right.
He also has this 5-step process for achieving goals that I find really intriguing.
It's a process designed to turn achievement into a cycle of continuous learning and improvement.
So it's a cycle.
He argues that goals are just the starting point.
Right.
The real magic happens in how you handle the inevitable obstacles and setbacks that you'll encounter along the way.
Right. The podcast we have breaks it down like this. First, you have clear goals.
Yes.
Then you identify the problems that stand in your way.
Exactly.
You diagnose the root causes of those problems, design solutions, and then execute those solutions. But it's not just a linear process.
Exactly. Dalio emphasizes that each step informs the next.
Okay.
And the entire process is a loop.
Okay.
So you execute your solution, you encounter new problems, you go back to diagnosis, you refine your approach, and so on.
Right.
It's about constant iteration and improvement.
It reminds me of this time I was trying to learn a new programming language.
Oh, yeah?
I kept running into these roadblocks and getting so frustrated.
I bet.
It was only when I took a step back
Yeah.
and really tried to understand the specific issues I was having that I was able to find the right resources and finally make progress.
That's a perfect example of Dalio's process in action.
Yeah.
Instead of just charging ahead, you paused, reflected, and adjusted your approach based on the feedback you were getting.
So it's about being strategic and methodical, not just relying on brute force.
Yeah.
And I bet radical transparency could play a role even in this goal-setting process.
Absolutely. Imagine if you were working on a project and hit a wall.
Right.
Being able to openly discuss your challenges with your team, or even just with yourself without fear of judgment, could help you identify blind spots.
Right.
And come up with more creative solutions.
Right, because sometimes the hardest part is admitting that we need help. Or that we don't have all the answers.
For sure.
But then there's the whole issue of setbacks.
Oh.
What happens when even with the best planning and the most honest feedback, things just don't go our way?
This is where Dalio's perspective on failure gets really interesting.
Okay.
He has this famous equation: pain plus reflection, progress.
Okay, I love that.
Yeah.
It's so simple, but it completely reframes how we think about setbacks.
Yeah.
It's not about avoiding failure. It's about learning from it.
And that reflection piece is key.
Okay.
It's not enough to just experience the pain of a setback.
Right.
We have to actively analyze what happened, extract the lessons, and figure out how to do things differently next time.
I see.
Dalio himself is a great example of this. The podcast mentions a story from the book where he made a huge financial blunder early in his career.
Oh, I'm curious about this.
Yeah.
What happened?
Well, back in the early 80s,
Okay.
Dalio was convinced that the U.S. economy was on the verge of collapse.
Oh, wow.
He went all in on this prediction,
Uh-oh.
advising his clients to brace for a major downturn.
Wow.
But he was completely wrong.
Yeah.
The economy boomed, and his firm lost a ton of money.
Ouch. That must have been brutal.
Yeah.
Both for his ego and his bank account.
It was. He even had to borrow money from his dad to keep the business afloat.
Wow.
But instead of giving up, he decided to dissect his mistake.
Mm.
He realized he'd based his prediction on a flawed understanding of the economic system.
He hadn't considered all the variables.
So he took a really painful experience and turned it into a learning opportunity.
Exactly. He dug deeper into economic history, refined his models, and ultimately, that experience laid the foundation for Bridgewater's future success.
Wow.
It's a powerful reminder that setbacks, no matter how painful, can be incredibly valuable if we approach them with the right mindset.
It makes you wonder if we're too afraid of failure in our culture. Interesting. Maybe we need to embrace the idea that mistakes are inevitable and actually essential for growth.
That's a great point, and I think that brings us to another key aspect of Dalio's framework.
Right.
His approach to decision-making. He's a big believer in using algorithms and data to make choices, especially in business.
Okay.
He argues that by taking emotion out of the equation, we can make more objective and rational decisions.
Okay, that makes sense in the financial world where you're dealing with numbers.
And risk assessment. But how does that translate to our everyday lives? I mean, I'm not going to run an algorithm to decide what to have for dinner.
Of course not. But the principle is still relevant.
Okay.
It's about creating a system for decision-making.
I see.
A set of principles that are based on your values and experiences and that help you make more consistent and informed choices, even in everyday situations. It's like creating your own personal decision-making algorithm, even if it's not a literal computer program.
So instead of just going with my gut or getting swayed by my emotions, I should develop a more deliberate approach based on what I've learned about myself and what's important to me.
Exactly. And this ties back to the idea of building a principled life.
Okay.
It's about having a clear set of values and guidelines that inform your choices, big and small.
Oh, okay.
So that you're not constantly reacting to every situation as if it's brand new.
I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together, but it seems like a lot of work. How do you even begin to figure out what your core principles are?
It's a process of self-discovery.
Okay.
And I think that's a great place to pick up in our next segment.
Okay.
We'll dive into how Dalio suggests we go about identifying those core principles that will guide our lives.
I'm definitely intrigued. We'll be back soon to continue our exploration of principles. Until then, start thinking about what values and beliefs are truly important to you. It might just be the first step in building your own principled life. Welcome back to our deep dive into Ray Dalio's principles. Before the break, we were talking about how Dalio encourages us to create a set of personal principles, kind of like our own internal compass, to help guide our decision-making.
Yes, he argues that having this kind of framework can lead to more consistent and informed choices, even in everyday situations.
Okay, but I have to admit, I'm still a little lost on how to actually figure out what my core principles should be. Where do you even start with that?
Dalio suggests we look back at our experiences, both the good and the bad, and try to identify the patterns that emerge. What values have consistently guided your decisions? What have you learned from your mistakes? What gives you a sense of purpose and fulfillment?
So it's not about just coming up with a list of rules to follow blindly.
Exactly.
It's about taking a deep look at yourself and understanding what truly matters to you.
Right. And this might sound a bit touchy-feely.
Sure.
But it can actually be incredibly empowering.
Okay.
When you live by a set of principles that are aligned with your values, it brings a sense of clarity and integrity to your action.
I can see that. But wouldn't that take a lot of time and self-reflection? Like, how do you fit that into a busy life?
Well, it doesn't have to be an overnight transformation.
Okay.
Start small. Maybe take a few minutes each week to reflect on your recent decisions.
Okay.
Ask yourself, what motivated me to act this way? Were my actions in line with my values? What could I have done differently?
So it's like a continuous process of checking in with yourself.
Right.
Making sure your actions are aligned with what you believe in.
Exactly. And over time, you'll start to see patterns emerge.
Okay.
You'll notice certain values that keep coming up, certain principles that guide your decisions, even when you're not consciously thinking about them.
This reminds me of something we talked about earlier, Dalio's idea of using algorithms in decision-making.
Yeah.
It might seem strange to connect that to personal principles,
Yeah.
but I'm starting to see a link here.
I'm glad you brought that up. At their core, algorithms are just formalized decision-making processes.
Right.
They take a set of inputs, apply a set of rules, and produce an output.
Right.
In a way, that's what we're doing when we develop personal principles.
Yeah.
We're creating our own internal algorithms based on our values and experiences.
So instead of relying solely on gut feeling or getting swept up in the heat of the moment, we have this framework to fall back on. It's exact.
A set of guidelines that can help us make more thoughtful and deliberate choices.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And it's not about becoming robotic or rigid in our thinking.
Okay.
It's about having a foundation to build upon, a set of principles that can guide us when we're faced with tough decisions or unexpected challenges.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this could be really powerful.
Yeah.
But I also wonder if it's possible to get too attached to our principles, to the point where we become inflexible or unwilling to adapt to new situations.
That's a really insightful point, and something Dalio addresses in the book.
Okay.
He emphasizes that principles aren't meant to be static or unchangeable.
Right.
They should evolve as we learn and grow.
So it's not about clinging to a rigid set of rules.
Right.
It's about being open to new information, new experiences, and even changing our minds when it's appropriate.
Exactly. And that brings us back to one of the core themes of Dalio's work, the importance of continuous learning.
Right.
He encourages us to be curious, to challenge our assumptions.
And to never stop seeking out new knowledge and perspectives.
It makes me think about how easy it is to get stuck in our own ways.
Yes.
To cling to what's familiar, even when it might not be serving us anymore.
Yes, and I think that's where the idea of radical transparency comes back into play.
Okay.
Being open to feedback, even if it's critical, can help us identify those areas where we might be clinging to outdated beliefs or habits.
So it's like having a system of checks and balances.
Right.
We have our principles to guide us.
Right.
But we also need to be willing to question them, refine them, and even let go of them when necessary.
Precisely. And that requires a certain level of humility.
Okay.
The ability to admit when we're wrong and to learn from our mistakes.
Right.
Which, as we've discussed, is a key part of Dalio's philosophy.
Right. It all ties back to that equation.
Yeah.
Pain plus reflection, progress.
Exactly.
It's not about avoiding setbacks.
Right.
It's about learning from them and using them as fuel for growth.
And I think that's a powerful message, especially in a world that often celebrates perfection and instant gratification.
Right.
Dalio reminds us that real growth takes time, effort, and a willingness to embrace the messiness of the journey.
I'm really struck by the idea that this framework isn't just about achieving success in a traditional sense.
Yeah.
It's about building a life that is both meaningful and fulfilling, a life that is aligned with your values and allows you to make a positive impact on the world.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another key aspect of Dalio's philosophy that we haven't touched on yet.
Okay.
The importance of building meaningful relationships.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does that fit into this whole framework of principles and decision-making?
Well, Dalio believes that relationships are essential for both personal and professional growth.
Okay.
They provide us with support, challenge us to grow, and offer different perspectives that can broaden our understanding of the world.
That makes sense. But how do we build those kinds of relationships, especially in a world that can feel so fast-paced and transactional?
Dalio emphasizes the importance of authenticity, empathy, and genuine connection.
Okay.
He argues that we should strive to build relationships based on shared values, mutual respect, and a willingness to be vulnerable with each other.
So it's not just about networking or trying to get ahead.
No.
It's about building genuine connections with people who share your values.
Right.
And who you can trust and learn from.
Exactly. And that requires us to be intentional about the relationships we cultivate.
Okay.
It means prioritizing quality time with the people who matter most. Being present and engaged when we're with them.
Right.
And offering support and encouragement when they need it.
It makes me think about how easy it is to get caught up in the hustle and bustle of life.
Yes.
And forget to nurture the relationships that are most important to us.
Yes, and I think that's why Dalio's emphasis on relationships is so valuable. It reminds us that true success isn't just about individual achievement.
Right.
It's about building a life that is rich with meaningful connections and shared experiences.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's about finding that balance between striving for our goals and nurturing the relationships that bring us joy and support.
Yeah.
But I'm also wondering,
Okay.
how do we handle those relationships that are challenging or even toxic?
Right.
Does Dalio offer any guidance on that?
That's a great question, and one that we'll definitely want to explore further. But before we dive into that, I think it's important to acknowledge that building a principled life, as Dalio describes it, isn't always easy.
Right.
It requires effort, self-awareness, and a willingness to face those uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our relationships.
You're right. It's not a quick fix or a magic formula.
Right.
It's a journey, and one that requires us to be honest with ourselves,
Yes.
open to feedback,
Yeah.
and willing to make adjustments along the way. But I have a feeling it's a journey worth taking.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great place to wrap up this part of our conversation.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground, from identifying our core principles to the importance of building meaningful relationships.
And in our next segment, we'll delve into some of the more challenging aspects of Dalio's philosophy, including how to handle difficult relationships and navigate those inevitable conflicts that arise in both our personal and professional lives.
So until then, we encourage you to reflect on what we've discussed today. What principles resonate most strongly with you? What areas of your life might benefit from a more principled approach?
Right.
And how can you start incorporating these ideas into your daily life?
We'll be back soon to continue our exploration of principles. Until then, keep those minds open and those conversations flowing. You know, as we've been talking about Dalio's ideas, I've been struck by how his approach to life and work really emphasizes this constant evolution.
Right.
It's not about having all the answers or reaching some fixed destination.
Yeah, it's more of a journey. It's about embracing the journey of learning and growth.
Yes. Dalio seems to encourage us to view life as this continuous experiment. Where we're constantly testing our hypotheses, gathering feedback, and making adjustments along the way.
And a key part of that experimentation process is being willing to confront our mistakes and setbacks.
Yeah.
Which can be tough.
It can.
Especially in a culture that often values perfection and avoids failure at all costs.
Dalio argues that setbacks are inevitable and that they're actually essential for growth.
Right.
He has this great quote from the book.
Yeah.
Pain plus reflection, progress.
It's so simple.
It is.
But powerful.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that we shouldn't shy away from challenges, but rather embrace them as opportunities to learn and improve.
Exactly.
And it makes me think about how we often try to shield ourselves from discomfort.
Right.
Both in our personal and professional lives.
Yeah.
We avoid difficult conversations.
Right. We stick to what's familiar, even when it might not be serving us anymore.
Dalio challenges us to push beyond our comfort zones, to seek out honest feedback, even when it's hard to hear, and to be willing to change our minds when presented with new information.
It's like he's encouraging us to embrace a growth mindset, where we view challenges as opportunities for learning rather than threats to our ego.
And that ties back to his principle of radical transparency, which we talked about earlier.
Right.
It's about creating an environment where people feel safe to speak their minds, share their ideas, and even disagree with each other without fear of judgment or reprisal.
But I imagine that creating that kind of environment takes a lot of intentionality and effort.
It does.
How do we actually put radical transparency into practice? Especially in situations where there's a power dynamic at play, like between a boss and an employee, or even in our personal relationships.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And Dalio acknowledges that radical transparency isn't a quick fix. It requires building a culture of trust and respect, where people feel valued and heard, and where feedback is given and received with the intention of helping each other grow.
So it's not about just being brutally honest all the time.
Yeah.
It's about creating a space where open and honest communication is the norm.
Exactly.
And where people feel comfortable sharing their perspectives, even if they're dissenting opinions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that can be challenging, especially in situations where there are strong emotions involved, or where people have different perspectives on what's best.
Right, because even with the best intentions, conflicts are bound to arise.
They are.
And I'm curious how Dalio suggests we navigate those situations.
Okay.
Does he offer any guidance on how to handle disagreements or difficult conversations?
He does, and he emphasizes the importance of approaching conflict with a spirit of curiosity and open-mindedness rather than defensiveness or aggression.
So instead of trying to prove ourselves right or win an argument,
Right.
we should aim to understand the other person's perspective
Yeah.
and find a solution that works for everyone involved.
Yes. And it requires active listening, empathy, and a willingness to compromise.
It sounds like it takes a lot of maturity and self-awareness to approach conflict in that way,
It does.
especially when our emotions are running high.
It does. But Dalio argues that it's essential for building strong and healthy relationships, both personally and professionally.
And I think that's a powerful message because so often we view conflict as something to be avoided at all costs. But maybe it's actually an opportunity to deepen our understanding of each other and strengthen our bonds.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the most valuable takeaways from Dalio's work.
What is it?
It's not just about achieving success in a traditional sense. It's about building a life that is rich with meaningful connections, grounded in shared values,
Right.
and fueled by a constant desire to learn and grow.
It's about creating a life that feels both fulfilling and impactful, where we're not just going through the motions, but rather living with intention and purpose. And I think that's a message that resonates deeply with a lot of people, especially in today's world, where it can be easy to feel lost, overwhelmed, or disconnected from what truly matters.
For sure.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Ray Dalio's principles, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought inspired by Dalio's emphasis on continuous learning and self-reflection.
Sounds good.
What are some areas in your life where you might benefit from embracing more nuance and complexity?
That's a good question.
Where might you need to challenge your assumptions, seek out diverse perspectives, or be more willing to adapt your approach?
Yeah.
By engaging in this ongoing process of self-reflection and critical thinking, we can continue to learn, grow, and create more fulfilling and impactful lives.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Ray Dalio's principles. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking, and we encourage you to continue exploring Dalio's work and to consider how his principles might apply to your own unique journey. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those conversations flowing.